So hi everyone, today I'm speaking to Martin Smith, who is a senior lecturer in Defense and International Affairs at the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst. Hi Martin.
Hi Max, thanks for having me back. It's good to see you again.
Nice to see you. Nice to see you. So Martin, what is your opinion on the latest developments, conflict situation between Ukraine and Russia, in the East especially?
I'm not as pessimistic as some analysts seem to have been recently. I think we're still in a situation of strategic stalemate. Russia is, as we know, very slowly and grindingly advancing in the Donbass, but at huge cost in terms of losses of personnel. We regularly see reports that Russia is losing 1,000 or more people every day in the Donbass for the sake of making limited gains. And the second point I would make is the gains that Russia has made are not as yet, and I'm not sure they're going to be strategically significant. We talk a lot about Pokrovsk in particular, and I was reading just recently reports from the front, from the Ukrainian front, suggesting that the front around Pokrovsk is actually being stabilized, and that Russia has not made any further significant gains over recent days. So I don't see, my view is, as it's been for a long time now, Max, I don't see Russia making any decisive breakthroughs. I don't see Ukraine collapsing. I think Ukraine is continuing to pursue what Mr. Zelensky and others have described as the approach of active defense. It's not just sitting back and waiting to absorb the blows made by Russia. It's taking the fight literally to Russia itself through the regular drone and missile attacks in Crimea, but also energy infrastructure targets inside Russia, and of course through the Kursk incursion, which seems to have been partially reversed by Russia. But at the most, there are reports suggesting that Russia has regained between 25 and 50% of the territory occupied by Ukraine. But that, of course, still means that Ukraine occupies a significant salient of territory inside Russia itself. So I don't think that Russia is going to make a decisive breakthrough this winter. It's going to be a hard winter. It's going to be a hard winter militarily for Ukraine. It's going to be a hard winter for Ukrainian society generally, because Russia is undoubtedly going to ramp up its attacks on the energy infrastructure in Kyiv and other population centers. But at the moment, I see no evidence that, as I say, either Russia can break through decisively, or on the other side of the coin, that Ukraine, either militarily or in terms of morale on the home front, is going to collapse and capitulate.
And quick question, in terms of this Kursk invasion, you think Ukraine reached its initial strategic objective or not?
Well, of course, that depends on what you consider its strategic objective to be. In terms of, let's say there were two main ones, in my view. In terms of drawing away significant Russian focus from the front in Donbass, then no. That doesn't seem to have happened, at least to the extent that Russia has stopped trying to take the offensive and stopped trying to make even incremental gains in the Donbass. In terms of the other objective, as I see it, which was to do two things, was again to demonstrate that Ukraine is still capable of taking offensive action as part of its overall strategy of active defense. It's not purely on the defensive, waiting to try to absorb Russian blows as best it can. So it demonstrated and continues to demonstrate, it continues to hold territory in Kursk, as we know, and that demonstrates, as long as Ukraine can do that, that demonstrates that it is capable of literally taking the fight to Russia. And also psychologically, and we don't know what impact this has had. It's very hard to determine what impact this has had, but I think it's reasonable to speculate that psychologically it must have had an impact on the Russian home front, because it's demonstrated that Russia, the great power that Mr. Putin keeps talking about, cannot even fulfill the core responsibility of any effective sovereign state, which is to secure its borders and to provide for the security of its own citizens. So the Kursk incursion, I think, in that respect, has been singularly successful, because it has demonstrated that. It's demonstrated that to the Russian audience. It's demonstrated that, and we've heard lots of reports of the morale boosting impact that had domestically inside Ukraine. And it's also shown to Ukraine's Western partners that it is still capable of taking the fight to Russia. And of course, the subtext of that, and Mr. Zelensky was very clear about this again in his address to the Rada just yesterday, is that Ukraine is still wanting support, military support from its Western partners, and it's still capable of using that military support effectively to stay in the fight. Yes, the situation looks bleak in Donbass at the moment, but that's not the whole picture. Elsewhere, Ukraine is still capable, still able and willing to take the fight to Russia. And Russia, as we've seen, as Ukraine, the Kursk incursion is now 2.5 months old. Russia, as we see in some aspects, has no effective counter to what Ukraine is able and willing to do. So I think the Kursk incursion is a mixed picture. It didn't succeed in all its objectives, but I think on the other hand, it's going too far to say that it's failed overall as well.
So Martin, do you think that Russia is playing the war of attrition, trying to exhaust Ukrainian troops in light of its ramping up its military production and just having a clear superiority in manpower and everything else?
Yes, absolutely. And I think I'd make 2 points about that. First of all, that in itself, the fact that Russia has had to fall back on a military strategy of attrition is a significant failure relative to the declared objectives back in February 2002. Now, whether you believe that Mr. Putin seriously thought that he could be in Kyiv inside 3 days, I think is beside the point. It's clear from the way that the Russian forces attacked, the lack of a sustained logistic tail, for example, that the Russian leaders and Russian military commanders believed that Ukrainian resistance was not sustainable, and certainly on a national basis, it was going to collapse quickly, if not in a matter of days, then in a matter of weeks. And we can all see very clearly that has been far from the case. So the fact that Russia's had to revert to a very costly strategy of attrition, we all know the statistics, there's no agreement, but even at the conservative end of the spectrum, Russia has lost over 100,000 military personnel killed and at least 350,000 casualties overall, tens of thousands of pieces of military equipment. So attrition is proving to be very costly for Russia, and it's also an indication of how its initial strategy failed completely. Is it seeking to wear down Ukraine? Yes, but it's seeking also, secondarily, to convince Ukraine's Western partners that it's not worth continuing to support Ukraine, certainly not in terms of donations of military equipment and military training programs, etc., which is why I think things like the Kursk incursion and the regular attacks on Crimea and the drone strikes inside Russia are so important, because, as I suggested earlier, they're not just sending a message to Russia, to Russian leaders and to the Russian people more generally. They're also, I think, designed to send a message to Ukraine's Western partners that, yes, Ukraine is suffering, and yes, militarily, it's not by any means in an ideal position on the Eastern Front, but the overall objective of attrition in terms of grinding down morale and the willingness to continue the fight, they are not succeeding. That Ukraine is basically holding the line in the East, I would argue. Russia is not making decisive and has not made decisive gains this year. And as we know, the fighting season will soon have to draw to a close because of the onset of winter. Russia has not made decisive gains. So again, it's had to fall back on attrition. But equally, attrition so far isn't working either, because Ukraine is not showing, the Ukrainian society, the Ukrainian government is not showing any signs of being ground down to the extent of capitulating and, if you like, raising the white flag. And equally, so far, and of course, the big question is what happens if Donald Trump wins the US election next month. First of all, we don't know who's going to win, of course, and secondly, we don't know what's going to happen, but that is a question, and undoubtedly Mr. Putin is focused on that, and his hope, if not expectation, is number one, Mr. Trump will win, and number two, Mr. Trump will stop American assistance to Ukraine. And if that happened, that would undoubtedly be very serious, because I think it wouldn't just be stopping American assistance. My own sense is if the US made it clear that it was going to stop assisting Ukraine militarily and actively, that would have a knock-on effect in Europe. And I think you would see, not all, but I think you would see a number of European NATO allies having second thoughts about sustaining their own military assistance to Ukraine as well. So that is the big unknown factor at this stage, and that is the one that's most likely to change the equation. But at the moment, to answer your question again, Max, yes, Russia has had to fall back on an attritional strategy, but at the moment, that's not working for Russia either, as far as I can see.
So we currently can witness a stalemate, right? So if there is,
yeah.
Right.
In a nutshell, the situation as pretty much it has been, I would say, since the Russians were driven out of the western parts of Kherson in just about a couple of years ago now, in the autumn of 2022. The situation strategically has been overall a stalemate, and that hasn't changed fundamentally, as far as I can see, over the last couple of years now. So unless there is a significant change of policy on the part of the United States, I really don't see how it's going to change in the future either.
So in light of this, do you think that Ukraine should, with Russia, Russia should seek some kind of resolution to that?
I think yes, because there's no way out. Of course, the stalemate works both ways. I don't believe, and I know President Zelensky has been talking a lot about his great, inverted commas, victory plan, and I understand for political, presentational reasons of morale, that's a label he probably feels he has to use. But militarily, the other side of the coin is I don't see a route to a Ukrainian military victory either. Meaning, what would military victory look like? Well, I think it's quite clear what it would look like. It would mean either driving the Russian occupiers out of all of Ukraine's sovereign territory, or defeating them so decisively as being able to compel Russian leaders to call for a ceasefire and an armistice that would lead to that process happening subsequently. I just don't think that Ukraine has the capability, and I don't think that there is the degree of support and commitment on the part of the Western partners to allow that to happen. So the stalemate means that it is in Ukraine's interest, in my view, to explore the possibility of a peace agreement, not just a ceasefire, because Mr. Putin, as we know, has basically said you can have a ceasefire anytime you want, on the basis of, as he keeps saying, accepting the realities of the situation. In other words, at the minimum, Ukraine and its Western partners would have to accept the Russian occupation of Crimea and of the 4 partially occupied eastern oblasts. That is a no-no from Ukraine's point of view, and in my opinion, quite rightly so. However, in terms of a peace agreement, so I think Ukraine, going back to your question, should Ukraine be actively thinking, and are there indications that the Ukrainian government is beginning to think? Straws in the wind, as we say, so nothing firm, but statements that are being made by President Zelensky and other Ukrainian leaders, statements that are being made by some of the Western partners, suggest to me that there is thinking and there's some level of discussion going on behind the scenes as to what an acceptable compromise peace might look like. So a ceasefire is not enough unless it is the first step to a negotiating process between Ukraine and Russia. What, in my view, and I know this is contentious, but to answer your question fully, in my view, what might, inverted commas, an acceptable peace look like? It's going to be a compromise. By definition, any negotiated settlement will be a compromise, meaning that both parties would have to make painful concessions. So is it possible, is it even desirable to envisage Ukraine agreeing, not because it's been beaten in war, but agreeing to concede some of the, at least of the contested territory to Russia in exchange for significant Russian concessions? And the most significant concession that Russia could give, that would be, number one, very beneficial to Ukraine, and number two, would fundamentally signal that Ukraine has achieved its overall strategic and political objective, which is to, if you like, become fully part of Europe, to join the West, as it's sometimes expressed. What would be necessary to ultimately underwrite that? It would be Ukrainian accession as quickly as practically possible to both NATO and the European Union. And of course, we shouldn't forget what a huge concession that would be on the part of Russia. So there's not a compromise peace. It's very easy for people like me to sit here and to talk about. In practice, I'm not underestimating at all how difficult that would be to achieve, because it would require really big and painful compromises on the part of Ukraine, having to accept some degree of territorial concession, but equally it would require in exchange really big and strategically and diplomatically fundamental concessions on the part of Russia, particularly, of course, conceding the principle of Ukrainian membership of NATO. And if I can make another final strategic point as well, Matt, because I think this is often overlooked, any sort of durable peace agreement would have to take into account the situation in the Black Sea. Let us say, for the sake of this argument, that Crimea was conceded to Russia as part of, accepted as being part of the Russian Federation going forward. That, of course, would give the Russian Navy ongoing access to the port of Sevastopol. And it would theoretically be in a position where it could threaten Ukraine's commercial maritime traffic. Clearly, that couldn't be allowed to happen. So again, what Russia would have to accept is some degree of internationally supervised demilitarization, restrictions and controls on what it could do in terms of its maritime capability in the Black Sea. And I don't think that's even really been discussed so far, but that in itself would require a significant concession on the part of the Russian Federation. So I think I mention all of these because I think at the moment, the limited debate that's taken place, particularly here in the West, tends to focus on what Ukraine would have to give up, what Ukraine would have to concede in order to get peace from Russia. I think that's the wrong way to look at it, because that will be one-sided and unbalanced by definition. If any peace agreement is going to stick, if it's going to be durable, then both sides are going to have to make significant concession. So I don't think we should underestimate the nature and degree of the concessions that Russia would have to make. Is it willing to seriously contemplate those? As far as we can tell from the public debate at the moment, no. Might it be so if Ukraine can get through another winter without collapsing, and by continuing its strategy of active defense, by continuing to hurt Russia at home and to hurt Russian interests in Crimea and in the Black Sea, for example? I don't know is the answer to that question, but I can foresee a situation, let's say by the spring or the summer of next year, when enough people around Mr. Putin are beginning to ask, what is the point of carrying on? Could Russia carry on? Yes. Could it carry on indefinitely? I'm not sure about that, but it could carry on. But again, flip around. Has Russia been militarily been suffering really significant losses? Yes, it has. So it's not necessarily a question of could it carry on militarily. It's at what point do Russian leaders decide that it's actually not worth carrying on because it's suffered, it's taken all these losses, these tremendous losses in numerical military terms, losses of personnel and equipment, for incremental gains which are not decisive and strategically significant. As long as Ukraine, its Western partners, can convince Russian leaders that they're not going to make a decisive breakthrough. Let me make a bold prediction here. If they can convince Russian leaders that a decisive breakthrough is not forthcoming, they can carry on, but they're not going to achieve a decisive breakthrough, a decisive victory. The point will come, in my judgment, when enough Russian leaders start asking the question, if we're not going to make a decisive breakthrough, even if we could carry on and continuing suffering these losses, is it worth doing so? Or should we cut our losses and take what we've got, which is the territory that Russia currently occupies, but accept that in exchange, we're going to have to make Russia is going to have to make some significant concessions of its own. I think that we haven't got to that point yet. I think that point is reachable, providing there isn't a strategic collapse and a capitulation this winter, which I don't think is going to happen. And I think 2025 will be the point, will be the year, sorry, at which that point on the Russian side is reached. That's my sense. I obviously don't know that, but that is the sense that I increasingly have.
So Martin, maybe they're trying just to wait to see the outcome of U.S. elections, and while pushing Ukraine more actively, and they recruit like 30,000 people, I think, on a monthly basis. Plus, also there's rumors about North Koreans also being deployed. So maybe they're just trying to push and to activate the to achieve more territorial gains, right?
I think, yeah, absolutely. I think Russia is trying to throw as much as it can at it militarily. So as you say, there are reports about North Korea, not just North Korea supplying munitions, but possibly North Korean soldiers getting involved on the ground in eastern Ukraine. There are reports about increased support, perhaps through the provision of ballistic missiles alongside the attack drones that it's been providing for a couple of years now, that Russia might be in discussions about enhanced Iranian support, perhaps in exchange for enhanced Russian support to Iran in the context of the rising tensions in the Middle East. So yes, I would agree, Max. I think it's pretty clear that Russia is trying to throw as much as it can militarily into the fight, not just or even necessarily primarily in the expectation of making significant gains of territory, but to send a signal, and not again necessarily primarily to send a signal to Kyiv, but to send a signal to Ukraine's Western partners. And in particular, of course, as we said, all the attention at the moment is focused on the United States. And that is the big unknown. That is, if I can put it this way, the wild card is if Donald Trump, and of course there are two ifs here, if Donald Trump does win next month, And we don't know, Mr. Trump is nothing if not unpredictable, so we shouldn't make any assumptions about if he returns to the White House, he is automatically from day one going to start piling the pressure on Ukraine and scaling back, if not cutting off altogether, US assistance programs. We just don't know what would happen. But Mr. Putin clearly hopes that that would happen. And in order to demonstrate, if you like, Russia's resolve, as you suggest, he is committing as much and showing, I think these reports about enhanced North Korean support and enhanced Iranian support aren't necessarily going to make a difference tomorrow or next week or even next month. But I think for his part, what Mr. Putin is doing is showing that Russia still has something left, still has something in reserve in terms of its own recruitment and military production capabilities, as you've mentioned, but also in terms of the enhanced support that it is hoping, if not expecting, to gain from its key allies in this fight. So it's all to do with signaling. It's each side signaling Ukraine and its Western partners signaling to Russia that you're not going to win this thing, that we can keep fighting for as long as it takes. And Russia, for its part, signaling that you're not going to win this. We can sustain the fight for longer than you can. So your only option is to sue for peace on our terms. So there's a lot of basic political and, if you like, psychological signaling going on at the moment, it seems to me.
I also read some information that Ukraine is also trying to establish this communication to start negotiating process, but it seems like Russia, according to Ukrainian sources, refused to do so now because it has advantage in the battlefield, right?
Well, I think it has advantage. Yeah, I mean, I'm sure there'll be a lot going on behind the scenes that those of us who essentially have open source access won't know about. But that's plausible because Russia at the moment, at least pending the outcome of the American election, Russian leaders, I don't doubt a majority of Russian leaders still believe that Russia has the advantage, because they think militarily, in terms of the sheer ability of Russia to sustain a campaign of attrition, clearly it does have the advantage over Ukraine. Russian leaders believe, again, pending the outcome in the United States next month, but Russian leaders believe that Western support for Ukraine is not sustainable over the medium to longer term. So they believe that for those two reasons, Russia does have an advantage over the medium to longer term, which is why, again, coming back to what we were saying earlier, the task of the task at all levels, the task, put it bluntly, the task of the Ukrainian army, the task of the Ukrainian government and wide Ukrainian society standing behind its army, and the task of the US and its NATO allies and EU partners standing behind the overall Ukrainian defense effort, is to sustain the fight to the extent that it convinces a critical mass of opinion within the echelons of the Putin government that it's miscalculated, that if Russia believes that it can basically outlast Ukraine and its partners, then it is mistaken, and its alternative therefore has two alternatives: is to carry on just doing more of the same and taking these losses. Could it sustain these losses? Probably not indefinitely, I don't think, but probably for a decent period of time, yeah. But the question is not, can Russia sustain these losses, I think. The question is it worth Russia carrying on taking these kinds of losses for minimal gain? And if Ukraine and its partners can convince enough Russian decision makers and enough of Mr. Putin's advisors and military commanders that the answer to that second question is no, it's not worth it. So you need to start thinking about option two, which is some sort of compromise peace. Then we will see what I suggested earlier, which is Russia starting to take the prospect of a negotiated settlement seriously. And by seriously, I mean, of course, accepting that it's going to have to make compromise. Because at the moment, you talk to Russian spokespeople and they will say, Russia has always been interested in peace. You can have peace anytime you want, as long as you accept two things. Number one, that what is ours stays ours. In other words, the occupied territory, you accept that that is now fully and permanently a part of the Russian Federation. And number two, we're prepared to talk about some sort of security arrangement and some sort of guaranteed neutrality. And possibly even over the longer term, Ukraine could have EU membership, but no way could Ukraine ever be allowed to join NATO. We all know that that is has been so far a fundamental red line for Mr. Putin and his regime. So it's getting enough Russian leaders beyond the point where they just keep falling back on that. Say you can carry on for no gain and for a lot of pain in terms of the losses you're taking in Ukraine, or if you want to find a way out of this thing, then you're going to have to come to the negotiating table and be prepared to consider serious concessions. We're not there yet, but I do. This is why I know a lot of commentators would disagree with me here. But my sense is more optimistic than them. I do think that there is an increasing possibility. I wouldn't say probability, but an increasing possibility that Russia will get to that place during the course of 2025.
Martin, thanks. And don't you think that even if it gets to this place, this peace will not be long lasting, because they will still try to pursue their ultimate objective, let's say, taken over the whole Ukraine, or at least four oblasts, because it seems to me that they don't recognize Ukraine as a sovereign state, and they just want to install some pro-Russian puppet as a best case scenario, right?
The short answer to your question is yes, which is why Ukraine's membership of NATO is so absolutely fundamental. It's not just a nice to have or an optional extra. In my view, Ukraine, if he agrees to make any kind of territorial concessions, the sovereign state of Ukraine needs security guarantees, not just vague promises of the kind it had in 1994 via the Budapest Memorandum, that Russia recognizes its sovereignty and it has no aggressive intent, and the United States and the UK made similar statements, and they turned out, of course, not to be worth the paper they were printed on. There's only one place that Ukraine can get genuine and reliable and effective security guarantees that would deter a future Russian attack, and that is via membership of NATO, so that it comes within the framework of the famous Article 5 of the NATO Treaty. It has a mutual security guarantee, and its allies would regard an attack on Ukraine and its sovereignty and territory as being tantamount to an attack on their own sovereignty and territory. And Russia respects that, it seems to me, which is precisely the reason why Mr. Putin has been so far so absolutely insistent that the red line is no Ukrainian membership of NATO, because he recognizes that if Ukraine does join NATO, then that's a whole new ball game, if I can put it that way. That the prospects of Russian aggression and the consequences of Russian aggression are of such a different order of magnitude that Russia is effectively deterred. And I think, not the focus of our discussions now, but I think that there's plenty of evidence, even during the course of the current conflict since February 2022, that Russia Russia basically but both respects and fears the NATO security guarantee. That's why it's been very, very careful indeed not to do anything or risk anything militarily that would even hint at the possibility of any NATO member being able to claim that Russia had Russian military action had impacted on its own territory. So this is why, in my view, the absolute bottom line for Ukraine, if it got nothing else out of this, in terms of the peace agreement being sustainable, and as you say, this is why a mere ceasefire isn't enough, because in 2, 5, 10 years' time, Russia could reconstitute its military capability and, in plain English, come back for more. Clearly, that's in nobody's. It's not in Ukraine's interest. It's not in the interest of wider European security. It's not in the interest of Ukraine's European and North American partners to have to go through all of that again, potentially. The only reliable way to safeguard against that happening is Ukrainian membership of NATO. So, in my opinion, item number one on the Ukrainian agenda in any negotiation, not just, we'll talk about this a little bit later on, if we can sort of talk about some easier things first. I think item number one must be, it's not worth us even sitting down and having a negotiation unless the Russian side concedes that Ukraine will join NATO within the shortest practicable time. Otherwise, the scenario that you just outlined in your question, Max, becomes an ever-present possibility. And there's no peace. There's no durable peace worth the mention. There's a cease, just as there was a ceasefire, or various ceasefires in the period from 2014, after the first, the annexation of Crimea and the first Russian incursion into the Donbass, and February 2022, and we all know how that ended up. So a ceasefire in itself isn't enough. It has to be the precursor to a genuine negotiation, and the outcome of that negotiation to guarantee that the situation you identified in your question doesn't happen again, basically and plainly has to involve Ukraine joining NATO as soon as practically possible, in my view.
My only question is, how can Ukraine accelerate this process so we reach this point when Russia will be willing to concede and negotiate, right? And reach this compromise, yeah.
But by doing what it sounds like a slightly pat answer, but my honest answer is by carry on doing what it's doing already, fundamentally, most importantly, holding the line in the Donbass and elsewhere along the Eastern Front, which clearly doesn't mean stopping Russia from making any gains and taking population centers, but it means preventing Russia from making any decisive and strategic gains. And it means, of course, preventing a military collapse along any part of that front, which so far Ukraine has managed to do. And it also means continuing alongside that with the active defense approach, taking the fight to Russia. So in blunt terms, continuing the missile and drone strikes in the Black Sea and in Crimea. It means continuing the drone strikes against Russian energy infrastructure inside Russia itself. It means maintaining the Kursk incursion for as long as is reasonably possible. It might mean, and I know some Ukrainian leaders have hinted at further surprises for the Russians in future, it might mean further limited military incursions elsewhere along the Russo-Ukrainian border. All of that is not, it's not going to be militarily decisive, but it's, again, going back to the point, the importance of signaling. It sends a signal that, number one, Ukraine, most important, Ukraine is still in the fight. It's not, however bad things get, however bad things have got, Ukraine is not giving up. That's an important signal, not just to send to Russia, but equally important to the Western partners. So the Western partners, if you continue supporting and funding and equipping and training Ukraine, you're not just throwing resources into a black hole. That Ukraine is alive, it's kicking, it's still fighting, it's taking the fight to Russia, and of course, equally, it's sending the signal, exactly that signal to Russia, that we are still willing to take the fight to you, we're still capable of taking the fight, and we can still damage you, not militarily necessarily to the same extent that you could damage us, but politically and psychologically, back to the Kursk incursion, we can still damage you reputationally. We can still demonstrate to your own people, Mr. Putin, that you can't even guarantee their own security. You can't even defend Russian infrastructure and the Russian people from military action by Ukraine. So it's all of that, continuing to do it, not knowing when it's going to have the desired ultimate impact. You know, it seems to me that at some point in 2025, it's looking increasingly possible, but of course, nobody knows. And I would suggest at the moment, most people in Russia, most Russian leaders, sorry, at least, are not thinking on those along those lines. So it's not going to have the inverted commas desired effect anytime soon. I believe it will at some point, but I can't be any more specific than that. But to go again, to loop back to your question, to answer it directly, what do Ukraine and its Western partners need to keep on doing? They need to keep on doing what they're doing now and not lose heart and not lose the will to continue the fight on the part of the Ukrainians, and not lose the will to continue to support Ukraine's military effort on the part of the US and its Western partners.
Thanks, Martin. And is there anything else you would like to add? Because I ran out of questions.
No, I think we've had a good discussion there, Max. So I think that covers certainly. I think that covers the topics that we wanted to talk about this morning. So that's good for me. Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity to talk.
Thank you so much for your time today.
Absolutely, my pleasure as always. See you again soon, I hope.
See you.